Welcome, witches, wizards, and muggles alike, to another enchanting episode of Magical Tales from the Slytherin Common Room, bringing your favorite Harry Potter fan fiction to audio format. So sit back, relax, and Accio headphones and let the magic begin. Welcome back. We are on chapter 17. Just for any of those that are curious, we're about 26% through the book. It looks like, according to my Kindle. So yeah, we're just going to keep on growing. I think there's like 40-something chapters in total. It looks like the chapters are getting longer as we go on. I'm going to start breaking the chapters into 45-minute episodes. So one chapter may span multiple episodes, just so I can get them out to you guys quicker and you guys have access to them. So let's get started. Chapter 17. Trigger warning, explicit use of blood. So keep that in mind. There is a story out there for all of us, and in these stories, we are lost and found once more. There's comfort in knowing that there's a version of us somewhere, and thus we are not insignificant. We are known once, and will be known again one day too. Sophia Al-Jabbar, 1915. An entire day is wasted because Hermione simply refuses to be the first to give in. However, a problem rises when Hermione realizes she needs Malfoy because of her own foolish actions. She should never have gone to him in the first place regarding the runes and their translations. She should also never have given him half the books on said runes and translations because now she has questions, and because of her stubbornness, she's unable to get her answers. On top of that, Amina, busy as ever dealing with the logistics and new problems that arise every day with the expedition, is unable to help Hermione with the readings. Thus, Hermione is left alone reading and rereading the same book. Technically, this would have been a blessing, except she needs someone to bounce ideas off of. And because of her aforementioned foolishness, the only person who'd have any idea what she'd be talking about without her going on many tangents and wasting even more time is Malfoy. But Hermione has to make a point. The point being, Hermione Granger does not need anyone to find answers to difficult questions and will not tolerate any more disrespectful actions made toward her by a particular blonde. The point, of course, would require a very pointed aversion of Malfoy during the day. It would have been an excellent and productive goal of the day, except there are very limited opportunities as there aren't many places to avoid for Hermione to make her point. Initially, she thought she'd stay inside her tent for breakfast and avoid seeing anyone at all. But then she heard laughter from outside and Hermione got the familiar nervous panic clenching her throat. She feared she was missing out on a valuable joke or quirky anecdote, and if she didn't go there right now, everyone would have bonded without her. And for the rest of the trip, she would be the outsider, and she ended up spending hours grappling with loose threads and trying to make up for what she'd missed. It was mad thinking, she knew. She wasn't an outsider, and no one other than Malfoy had treated her with any malice so far that would even suggest any ideas or plans of ostracizing her. Still, Hermione sighed, took her book, and trudged outside. She was the last one for breakfast, and she had the mind to join the others, but then she saw Malfoy reading the lexicon, and a burst of anger filled her at the sight of the book. It was her book, regardless of the fact that he paid for it. She'd given it to him, and he dared to sit there and read it with such leisure as if things weren't at stake, as if time wasn't running out. He looked up when Amina called her name, and for a brief moment their eyes clashed. But Hermione had a point to make, so she took her plate of food, made an excuse of needing to review something in the diary, and had breakfast in her tent. The second time, during lunch, Hermione chose to sit beside Tony and Amina. A book in her hand, she mindlessly ate the rice pilaf while trying to multitask between listening to Tony's rendition of the course so far and reading up on the funerary text. When Malfoy came over to ask Amina a question, Hermione once again packed everything while very pointedly avoiding Malfoy and left. His slight frown was the only sign he even noticed. She'd been trying to make a point, but she feared that each time she walked away, she had been the one to look rude in the eyes of the others. Even worse, by mid-afternoon, Hermione started to forget the reason behind why she was even trying to make a point. She'd been angry at Malfoy's tendencies to ruin every intimate moment between them with his careless words. The anger turned into annoyance directed more at herself than Malfoy. What was the point of expecting a different outcome when Malfoy time and time again showed her who he was? She knew the moment she saw him in that garden what to expect from him on this trip. Dormant and unresolved anger that took the form of impotence and resistance against change. In the end, it really was her fault for having expectations. That was the crux when it came to Hermione. Hermione always thought she was closer to people than they were to her, and as much as the expectations increased immensely,
It only took one moment, and suddenly she thought she was friends with people who merely saw her as a coworker, an acquaintance, and a friend of a friend, someone you were forced to see every day on a trip. She thinks maybe the exaggerated misunderstandings of her relationship started in Hogwarts before the war. She'd been so desperate to make friends in this unknown world she'd be thrust into. She'd let anyone say cruel things to her as long as they were at least thinking about her. Because if she was the boring know-it-all, annoying, stuck up, the mudblood, then at least she was relevant. At least she had a role to play. Someone could have given her an extra quill during class, and suddenly Hermione was telling them about the book she'd recently read and the one time she broke a bone in primary school. She'd allow any opinions of her, no matter how hurtful, as long as she didn't mold into the curtains, fall into between the crevices of her bed, and disappear to the walls. It only got worse after the war. Hermione started to realize that all those cultivated friendships that had such gravity in life were slowly losing some of the same substance in the eyes of the others involved. Friends that became family were branching out into this new world that they'd fought so hard for her to revel in, the unknown possibilities and new people. "The entire wizard in Britain knows you," Harry said, in a rare moment where Hermione opened up about how she'd been feeling. "Just think of them as your friends. You won't feel alone then." Hermione just smiled. She hadn't known how to tell him that she wasn't alone. She was just lonely. And the feeling didn't change regardless of whether she was in the room filled with 100 people calling her name or a room with just one person who didn't even recognize her face. She still felt a sense of great desperation to dig her fingers into whatever she felt in her life until she bled and bled and bled and bled. Because if she bled, then maybe what she felt was real. She didn't want a new set of friends or grand crowds of strangers who thought of her in a way that was so far, so out of reach, like a formless ship on the horizon from who she actually was. She wanted her friends and what her life used to be like before everyone moved on. She's alive, yes, but she's also been collecting dust like a relic from a world past, only to be polished and exhibited when everyone else thought the time was right. And that's what happened with Malfoy, she realizes. She'd always been curious about him, wondered what kind of man the boy she once knew had become. The perception she had of him was stuck somewhere in time where the others had left her behind, and there was comfort in being frozen there with him. The glimpses she got of him in the newspaper were nothing compared to the real thing, and she wanted to open him like a favorite book of hers and read each word, each question mark, and put them together all over again into sentences and paragraphs until she memorized every single page. He laughed, and suddenly in the back of her mind it meant something more. Suddenly, there was someone from before that could be more now. But at the end of the day, it was all in her head. It was her fault for attaching meanings and moments that ultimately were just that for Malfoy. Fleeting, empty moments meant to be replaced by more transient moments. But dinner, Hermione was so agitated with herself that she tells Amina she isn't hungry and turns in early for bed. She tried so hard to ignore the laughter while she reads, and after an hour, mercifully, the voices turn into murmurs and whispers until finally another hour later the only sounds outside are those of the desert night. The claustrophobic quiet of her tent weighs down on her chest like an anvil, and she closes her eyes to remove some of the pressure. Seconds of trying to just breathe pass until Hermione pulls her legs out of the blanket and sits on the edge of her bed, just staring at the far side of the tent. She's feeling antsy. Needs to move to get out after sitting in her tent for 2 hours. Without a thought more, she pulls on her boots and grabs the book she's been reading off the bed. With a candle in her hand and a shawl around her shoulders, she unzips the tent and steps outside. It's calm. It's a calm, windless night. The air here is different from that near the ocean. There's an eerie stillness that creates an illusion of no life for miles. The tranquility is only cut by sounds of crickets and katydids and the occasional hoot of a desert owl nearby. It'll take some getting used to for Hermione. She misses the crisp wind in her hair at the cliff and the never-ending roar of the ocean. The canopy where most of the work happens during the day is set on the east side of the encampment, far enough that any sounds from her won't disturb the others and close enough she can make out any movements. Hermione settles in one of the chairs and sets up a candle to the side. She's in her pajamas, so she waves around the canopy to warm it up. She digs out her sugar quill and is well into her reading within 5 minutes when footsteps make her look up. Her body locks in a moment of fight or flight, and her eyes dart around the shadows looking for a place to vanish into. but all she sees is open darkness, and she curses herself for thinking it was a good idea to come out in the first place. Not that she'd known he'd be awake. The way he's still dressed in his day clothes makes it seem as if he hadn't even tried to get ready for bed. She's about to start swiftly packing in the last-minute attempt to escape when Malfoy steps into the canopy and says in a tone that suggests he's already bored of the conversation, "You've been avoiding me." Her stomach flips. Hermione lifts her nose. "Bold of you to assume you have enough relevance for me to do anything to you." His eyes are ashes in the dark. "I have a statement." Her gaze falls, and she distracts her hands from his words by stacking and restacking her books. If she doesn't look at his eyes, then she won't forget she's supposed to make a point. "That's unfortunate. It'll have to wait until tomorrow, or preferably never." "I found a mistake in your translation." Her eyes snap to him before she can stop herself. "Impossible." "I thought we talked about your lack of perceptiveness to mistakes, Granger." Hermione rolls her eyes. "Yes, Malfoy, I remember. I'm very flawed, etc., etc." "It's truly fascinating how fast you learn." She glares at him and pulls a chair out and sits down, uninvited. "What do you want, Malfoy? I'm about to go to bed." "You've only been here for less than 5 minutes." And he'd only know that if he'd been counting the minutes. Hermione narrows her eyes but doesn't say anything. When it's clear she's waiting for him to hurry up, Malfoy says, "Your translation for enter and access are wrong." "They mean the same thing." "Yes, but you translated them under one rune. I think they should be grouped under intentions such as goodwill." Hermione frowns. "What does goodwill have to do with anything?" He reaches for the parchment under her hand, seeming very careful not to touch her skin as he orients it towards him. He picks up the sugar quill and stares at it, a strange look passing over his eyes for a quick second before turning back to the parchment. "I've seen something similar to it before." He starts writing down the rune Hermione labeled as enter access from memory. It has a shape of a crescent moon with a single perpendicular line through the middle. In some ancient runes translations, the basic commands are often grouped according to the verb rather than the underlying intention. However, during my studying of linguistics, I did an emphasis on ancient language, and it was said, "When did you do linguistics?" Malfoy pauses, eyes flicking her way. "Last year." "Where?" she presses. The only linguistics she's ever studied was the book she had gotten on linguistics of spellcasting during her very brief stint at teaching. It was for the side paper she was writing on the technicalities and specifics of spellcasting, the actual study of language and etymology. Other than that of ancient runes was never part of the Hogwarts curriculum, so any interest in linguistics would have to be of one's own volition. "There was a course," he says blandly. "What's it called?" Malfoy exhales a controlled breath. "Theoretical and Applied Linguistics." Hermione's unable to recall the name. Was it being taught somewhere? I didn't know there were extra classes on the linguistics of ancient languages. Was it a ministry lecture? "What the hell does it matter, Granger?" Malfoy asks through gritted teeth. He looks like he's losing some of his restraint. There's a change in his tone that makes it seem that he wants her to drop it. It only makes her charge forward. "I'm just wondering if there are lectures on linguistics. Maybe I could join them too. Obviously, if there's a mistake in my translation, it'd be helpful to know why." "I'm telling you why right now." "Well, I'm well acquainted with the lectures being taught by the ministry at Hogwarts, but there are other ways I could have learned linguistics. There are universities." "Yes, but you said you attended a course, and all I'm asking is which one." "Wait, universities?" "And courses being taught that you don't know. You don't know every fucking course in the world. Universities." She echoes in disbelief. "Muggle universities, you mean?" Malfoy's mouth clamps shut and he glares at her. Even in the dark, Hermione can make out the tip of his ears turning deep red. It's the answer to her question he won't give her. Muggle universities. Draco Malfoy attended a Muggle lecture at a Muggle university and learned linguistics. So many. Hermione has so many questions that she has to ask, but she clears all of them from her head because she can't know his answer. Any explanation won't be enough for her, she reminds herself, and she and Malfoy are not friends that can talk about these types of things. She clears her throat. "What was the mistake again?" His brows rise in surprise. He hesitates, as if waiting for her to ask her real question, and when she looks back at him neutrally, he reluctantly turns back to the parchment. Some commands are translated not according to verb, but rather according to their intent. Giving access to someone by creating an entrance may require stating the intent. For example, Hermione leans in as Malfoy redraws a single rune and splits it into two components before rearranging it so that the crescent moon is angled to the left, but the line remains parallel. The angling of the runes to the left should show that the intention is required for activation. He angles another rune for union to the left. Union would also require intention, whether it be malice or goodwill. Malice would bar any commands. Hermione purses her lips in thought. How would the exact intent be measured? Malfoy sets a quill down. I suppose it would be similar to when casting a spell. The incantation relies heavily on the aim, much like an arrow. There are certain spells that have to be specifically intended by the caster. You're talking about the dark arts. Malfoy nods. Dark magic required a certain precedent of a damaged soul to be cast while also furthering the damage once cast. A caster had to need each cast unforgivable, and yet Hermione also knows that not all dark magic had to have a necessary damaging effect. A dark spell used for merciful means or done under correct intentions, such as when Snape killed Dumbledore, did not have the same soul-damaging effect. It all comes down to, once again, the activation of the rune. Hermione sighs, idling, twisting a curl near her shoulder. Her hair has seemingly grown more in the last 2 weeks on the trip than in the past year. Our intention is measured directly through our wand, and thus our magic. But we've already established that these runes are not activated in this way. She glances at Malfoy when he remains silent and finds him fixated on her fingers wrapped around her hair strand. His expression is unreadable, but the intensity of his gaze freezes her. She immediately lets go of the curl, and his eyes, crystal gray, snap to her face. She has to breathe in once, twice, before she can fully exhale the lodged breath. When she swallows the dryness in her mouth, Malfoy's eyes dip to the stretch of her throat peeking out from under her shawl. His lips part at the same time as hers, and her point. Somewhere in the unknown distance in the back of her mind, she has a point. With a great strength and stiff limbs, Hermione starts flipping the scattered books shut. The slam of the covers echoes painfully between the night sounds, but she continues with her loud moves and loud sounds, pretending she can't feel him still watching her. When she starts to take her parchment back from under his hand, he stops her by tugging it back his way. Granger. She hates the way he says her name, as if her name is the only answer to an ultimatum. She should hate him too, she thinks. Everything would be so much easier if at least she hated him. Hermione lets go of the parchment completely, still avoiding looking at him. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow. She grabs her books and is about to leave when she's stopped. Hermione's wide eyes drop to Malfoy's hand around her wrist before lifting to his face. He stares blankly at his hold. I'm trying, Granger. She can't look away from his face, can't feel anything other than the warmth enveloping her skin under his fingers. Somehow, she's able to control her voice. To do what? What you want. His thumb brushes against the delicate skin of her wrist with a feather-light weight that makes her think she's imagined it. He lets go, and his eyes drop to the hand he'd been holding her wrist with, a look of complete dismay before turning into a clenched fist. Don't ask. Don't ask. Don't ask. Don't ask, and nothing will change. And what do I want, Malfoy? She sounds breathless, as if she's been holding her breath for 100 years, and his answer will be the command to exhale. You want something real. A friend, he replies, stiff with discomfort, but I can't give you that. I can't give you anything you want. I don't know how to be your friend, Granger. I don't know how to do any of this. Her lips are parched and her breathing is painful. I don't think that's true, Malfoy. I don't know how, Granger, he cuts, shaking his head firmly. You have to believe that. It's all pretend. That's all. Pretend because it will never be real. Pretend because nothing was ever real. Hermione's lungs shrivel and her stomach drops as if she's fallen 20 stories. He's telling her he can't do it, and she has to believe him. No explanations, no expectations. Okay, that's okay. She swallows a lie until it melds into her blood and bones and becomes as true as the air in her chest. I believe you. Malfoy closes his eyes and sets his jaw painfully. Hermione studies him and the way his entire body goes rigid, as if trying to lock Malfoy into himself to prevent him from doing anything he'd regret. Thinking that he wants to be alone, she makes a move to leave once again. My father gave me 2 rare imperial gold-breasted bird eggs 5 months before my 13th birthday. Hermione halts at his voice. Malfoy's head dips low, and his gaze falls to his clasped hands on the table. A single imperial gold-breasted egg cost 45,000 galleons, and a single gold feather of a fully grown bird is priced up to 1,000 galleons. A single feather. I heard of them when my mother took me to Italy with the Zambini family. An exclusive breeder was brought to the Zambini Château, and it was mentioned offhandedly that the imperial eggs had just gotten off the market for some prince, and the second I heard those words, I knew I had to have it. All I knew was that I needed the damned eggs, and I didn't care what had to be done to get them. It was an obsessive craze. It was all I could think about, the fucking birds. I spent months after that trip convincing my father to get them for my birthday, knowing it was near impossible. I was a child with a stubborn demand, and he fulfilled it. The birds must have cost him an even higher price, but he did what I asked because that's what a father did. I knew, even when I first asked him, that he'd do it, and maybe that's why I thought of it as his love, and he saw it as an opportunity for a lesson. Malfoy's voice is bitter but laced with something different, something she hasn't seen in him yet. Hermione's frozen, heart in her throat, her pulse rocketing. She knows where this is going and how it's going to end. She wants to tell him it's okay. She doesn't have to know if it'll cost him. Even though she knows that's the whole point of this. He's trying to tell her why, and he wants it to cost him. Wants to give a part away in a poisonous exchange so she can understand why he can't. I spent 3 fucking months taking care of those eggs, and 2 months taking care of them when they hatched. Day and night, all I thought about was the birds and all the extra expenses that needed to be taken. I took them from my vault. Sometimes Blaze and Pansy would come to see, but they were never allowed to touch them. They were my birds, I'd say. I'd raised them, and they were so dependent on me that all I could think was mine, mine, mine. Father must have known how I felt about them, because the night before my birthday, once Mother had gone to bed, he took me to a separate room. He set me down, put his wand aside, and gave me a speech on patience. He said a new world was coming, but we needed to be patient for it. He said I needed to know real pain because people would try to take everything we knew from us, and I needed to want it bad enough to never allow it to happen. I needed to be ready to fight for it all, and I said yes to every command like I always did because he was my father. He was my father, and he was always right. That was my truth too. Father was always right. But then he brought the birds in, and I knew right away that this wasn't just a speech that I could blindly agree to. He took one of the birds and told me to snap its head. Hermione claps her palm against her mouth to stop the gasp. They were so fragile. A single wrong move of the finger would have easily snapped their spines, but I couldn't do it. I cried and begged him uselessly to let them be. He could have taken my inheritance, I told him. I'd never ask for another thing in my life, I said, but I couldn't do what he asked of me. He was so disappointed by my begging that he had to physically leave the room. He'd said he'd come tomorrow, and if they weren't dead, he'd take matters into his own hands, and their death wouldn't be as generous as the one he'd offered. I sat there for the rest of the night, shaking so hard I had to sit on the floor. In the end, I took the cage outside and let them both go and lied to Father. He must have known the truth, though, because a day later, Father told me the birds were domesticated so that they could never survive in the wild. In the end, they died anyways. Malfoy swallows heavily and looks up at Hermione, brows drawn and tight. Lets her see the raw and broken pain in his red-rimmed eyes that would have anyone falling to their knees. That's what I did, Granger, Malfoy croaks. I begged for the birds only to kill them. I take things that should never be mine, and I ruin them until there's no going back. That is what I learned, and that is where I come from. That is who I am. That's not who you are, Hermione says, her voice firm and sure despite the trembling of her body. He looks at her incredulously. Are you not listening to me? I am listening. It wasn't your fault. How can you even say that? I fucking killed those birds. They died. They would have died regardless of who killed them, and it would have been all my fault. I did that. Why did you let the birds go? What? You let both of the birds go, Malfoy. He said one bird, but you let both of the birds go. Why? I don't know. He blinks away the million questions in his eyes. That doesn't even matter. It does. Hermione crouches to her knees, her voice a plea. It does. You have all those false perceptions. He's already shaking his head at that, but she pushes forward. And you have convinced yourself to be something far worse than the truth of who you are. Don't you get it? The truth is that I killed my birds. The truth is you were a child and you were given a choice, and that was no choice at all. You were afraid and you loved your father and you loved those birds. And look at what my love does, Malfoy says hoarsely. My love kills, Granger. Hermione inhales sharply at that, lost for words. He screws his eyes shut, pain filling his features again, a rare glimpse of his truth that is so defeated, so unlike how Malfoy carries himself around her, that Hermione doesn't hesitate to reach for his hand. But Malfoy jerks when he feels her get close, making Hermione pause halfway, hand still drawn toward him. His reaction remains severe and tense, so she ends up dropping her hand to her side. Your love gave them life, she says finally, straightening to her full height. She exhales a quivering breath. Their life, however short, was filled with the love they might never have gotten to feel if it wasn't for you. You're right. They would have died anyway. Malfoy flinches. But for a moment, they were truly alive, Malfoy. They experienced a love so powerful, so freeing, that for a brief moment it was worthwhile to live. Your love made them live. I only wish you could see that too. When she leaves and Malfoy's dazed form dissolves into the darkness, Hermione wipes the wetness from her cheeks and realizes she's forgotten what the point of all of it was. Lena, yes? Do you remember the poem you recited the first night we arrived? Lena's hand still in Hermione's hair. Yes, I remember. I can't stop thinking about it. What was it about? It was a story on love. Love? Lena continues the plait she'd been braiding. I may be biased, but I do believe Arabic is perhaps the richest language in the world. Some even call it the mother of languages, because of how many words of other language stem from Arabic. It said a single word may have 3 different meanings, 7 ways to pronounce it, and 12 various interpretations. The poem I read is the story of 2 lovers, or rather all lovers, and the perplexity of love. Will you tell it to me again? The poem only briefly touches on some of the stages all lovers find themselves to suffer, Lena says, smiling. She reaches for her wand and waves it once to dim the candles. Another wave and a wisp of pale light streams out the tip of the wand to form 2 figures across the mirror's plane. We start at the beginning of love. Attraction is made of 3 core letters that also make up the word wind, suggesting that the first step of love is both transient and unstable. If there is no initial attraction, lovers who are not yet lovers can revert back into strangers as swift as the kiss of the breeze against their temple. The familiar lyrical lilt of Amina's voice is hypnotizing, leaving Hermione paralyzed in a trance. The 2 figures in the mirror turn in a gust of wind before transfiguring into a rose. Ka is the attachment of this brief attraction to one's heart, so that it is no longer unsteady like the wind. Much like a garment caught on a thorn, it requires a conscious detachment for it to no longer exist. Al-Kalala, or infatuation, is the physical form in which one love exists. Its roots are shared with another word that means difficulty or distress. Love now is something we feel in our chest, in our hands, our face. It exists as something corporal we can point out. Al-Lakis or Al-Sahif are perhaps the highest states of pleasure in love, while Al-Ishqi is the blinding of the heart of one lover to the other, where pleasure can be experienced without restrictions. Al-Kasaf refers to the pleasurable burning that is akin to heat that is felt when wax touches the skin. It is an inferno that is welcome, needed even. Pleasure can only be appreciated in pain. As Lena speaks, the 2 figures mold into each other, arms weaving around necks and faces melting as they become dripping candles. Hermione doesn't dare blink, too afraid she'll miss Lena's words or the scene in front of her. When these 4 stages have met, love takes a twisted turn as all fated things do. Al-Shakaf, step to a calamitous love that overwhelms. It is the covering of a heart like a disease, mutating first and then metastasizing to other organs as a superficial layer of destruction. The disease that starts from the outside digs its way into the heart as Al-Jawa, an all-consuming state of grief unlike any other. The figures meld into one and a small spark of light forms in the chest. When the hearts become enslaved with each other, Al-Tahim, it transforms once more, to this time, into a milady, Al-Tabal. It is an obsessive pursuit of the heart to overwhelm the beloved. There is but one goal, and that is to destroy. Hermione gasps as the spark weaves throughout the body, starting from the chest and entwining with the limbs before each frayed edge blazes into an all-consuming fire.
At this point, the end of love is intimate. It enters a state of complete chaos and disorder. Al tal digi. A chain of events where each bewilderment leads to a stumble in the dark. There's no clear path, no obvious passage where there is some ease to find. What's the last state? Hermione asks. The figure divides into two once more, each facing each other. Al-Hume. Insanity, an irrevocable end of the mind. The word has roots shared with Al-Hawa, where we first started. Even the utterance of Al-Hume ends with the closure of the lips. It is in the end, neither reason remained nor madness. When the beloved perished, it was only love that remained. Hermione watches as the figures lean forward, foreheads touching, and fall to their knees. A second later, they disappear in a swirl of smoke. Does love have to be like this? Hermione breathes, meeting Lena's eyes in the mirror. Can we not choose? Lena finishes the plate and ties the end with a string. There is no choice in love, Hermione. Hermione isn't satisfied with that answer. She shakes her head, the plate swinging from shoulder to shoulder. So that's it. To love another is to be violently destroyed. How will I know what kind of love I will get? Lena places her hand on either side of Hermione's head and leans her cheek to the side of her temple. Her voice is gentle, a mother speaking to a child. Mektum, my love, whatever is written for you, that is what you will find. Hermione steps out of her tent, her hands patting her braid to ensure it's secure. The temperature today has risen overnight, a pleasant beat of heat that wasn't yet sweltering but could be if relentless sun made of its mind. Hermione isn't much for braids. She'd always get tired halfway, arms aching, and would end up resorting to a pile of weight on top of her head. But Lena had seen her struggling to control her hair and offered to braid it into a plait. Her hands are still worrying with the stubborn curls that are already bouncing out of the plait when the tent across her opens. Hermione stops. Malfoy steps out, head ducking under the tent, fingers buttoning the sleeves around his wrists. Immediately, his eyes skim across the encampment before settling on Hermione. His eyes lift to her hair, a slight furrow between his brows. She can't decipher the change in his expression, but she drops her hands anyway, feeling self-conscious. Her gaze, wide-eyed, remains on him. He looks different. Gone are the exquisitely tailored dark shirts and dark pants. He's wearing linen, the real kind. Or at least that's what Hermione thinks the fabric is. It could be a fabric especially made for him somewhere in Cape Verde for all she knows. But the more striking look is not the change in fabric, but rather the colors he's donned on instead. A shirt the color of whipped cream, the top button left opened, light brown slacks, his dragon hide boots remain the same. Hermione always thought Malfoy transforms in the dark. All hard lines, Malfoy disappears into tall shadows of the night, becoming the darkness itself, with the stealth of midnight thief. Maybe there is a familiarity in the dark for him that is nothing more than the fact he is both within and without in the dark. He is both looming shadows and the one who emit them. In the light, however, he is all soft edges, accessible, welcoming if you ignore the chronic apathetic look on his face. He looks lighter, younger, as if he'd shed a layer of his skin, left behind a trunk of his old self, and has stepped into a new timeline. Very rarely has Hermione ever seen Malfoy directly in the sun. But with the afternoon sun bright above, it's almost painful looking at him. Still, with parted lips, she meets his eyes and stares. Some of the leaden sensation that was present between them yesterday is gone. Breakfast was normal. Malfoy sat in the corner with his journal, working away as he did, and when she entered, he'd looked up and Hermione hadn't felt the need to flee. When he looked away, it also hadn't felt dismissive. Things seemingly are at a standstill, and that's all she can ask of him. He takes a step forward in her direction when a sudden roar of engines grows from behind. Their heads snap in the direction simultaneously. When Hermione moves to see what is happening, Malfoy is fast at her heels. The sound brings the others from their tent. Amina pokes her head from the canopy and comes to stand beside Hermione. Together they watch a whirlwind of dust materialize as a series of trucks ramble their way. Oy vey, Tony says, his face twisted with displease. People. Hermione shows her eyes from the collecting dust with her hands once the trucks get close enough to stop a few meters away from the edge of their sight. The door of the first truck opens and a young, beautiful woman with tanned skin and dark hair jumps out. Remember what I said, everyone, Amina mutters under her breath, fixing everyone's stern look. We are travelers. She turns back around to face the strangers, plasters a large smile, and makes way They gathered trucks. Hermione follows. "Hello," Amina calls. The doors of the other trucks open and slam shut as others amble out, stretching limbs and chatting amongst themselves in a language Hermione suspects is Spanish. "Hello," the woman with the dark hair smiles, removing some of the dust from her shirt. There's a distinct lilt to her accent that makes her voice sound like honey in holiday summers. "Sorry to intrude on you people like this, but it was a prayer come true to see you all here. We had to stop over." "My name is Amina Malik." Amina shakes hands with the woman before gesturing to Hermione and the others with a vague wave of her hands without introductions. "What can we help you with?" "My name is Carmina Silva," the woman replies. Her eyes jump around the encampment, catching on Hermione. Her eyes widen, though briefly, in recognition, and Hermione's hands turn sweaty. She takes a small step back to uselessly obscure herself behind Amina's shoulder. The woman reluctantly pulls her gaze away and turns back to Amina. "We're from a subdepartment of the Spanish Department of Magical Cooperation, focused primarily on cultural and social anthropology." She pauses to take out a tag from under her shirt that includes the identification and credentials. Amina steps closer to look. "We spent the last 3 months in Morocco and the last 5 days completely lost in the desert." Amina's brows rise to her hairline. 5 days? Carmina nods solemnly. "At least that's what we've calculated. We've been just south for the past few months and have been trying to make our way to our next destination, which was supposed to be a few miles north. We were to stay for another month before we trekked to Sahara and then make our way home to Spain. But we've lost some significant time. Can you tell us where we are?" "Just 4 days out of Seret," Amina says and motions to Tony. "We're meaning to make our way south for another 6 days. Tony here can help you out with the correct coordinates and regain some direction back north. If you'd like, you can join us for the night. I can only imagine how tired everyone is." "That'd be splendid," Carmina smiles gratefully. She turns to some of her men with rapid instructions and they dispatch some equipment and leave with Tony. "What brings you to the desert?" "Just passing through," Amina replies. "We were just about to have lunch and can set some for you and your group." Amina's words are cut off by a sharp gasp from Carmina. Carmina blinks several times and takes a staggering step forward. Is that Draco Malfoy?" Hermione jumps back just in time as Carmina squeals and hurtles forward to leap into Malfoy's arms. Hermione catches a momentary surprised look on Malfoy's face that quickly dissipates. As he secures his arms around her, Carmina wraps her arms around Malfoy's neck, her tall legs allowing them eye contact without her tilting her head back. Eyes fixated on the scene unfurling, Hermione's stomach twists when Malfoy leans towards Carmina's lips close enough to brush the curve of her ear, and he says something too low for Hermione to hear, but has Carmina throwing her head back and hooting a melodious laugh. "What the hell is going on?" Tony whispers to Hermione. "I have no idea," she mutters back. Carmina teasingly slaps Malfoy's arm before letting go of him and turning back to everyone's stunned face. She grins so wide, her entire face lights up. "I apologize for being so rude. It's just that I haven't seen this man in almost, 10 years, right, Draco?" Malfoy rubs his knuckles against his cheek and nods briskly in confirmation. He's deliberately not looking in Hermione's direction. "Well," Amina claps hands together. "Looks like there's a story to tell over lunch."